Quiet Suburban Evening. The sun had just begun its descent, casting long shadows across the quaint suburban neighborhood. In one of the houses on Maple Street, Sarah Thompson was putting the final touches on dinner. She was a meticulous woman in her mid-30s, with an eye for detail and a love for routine. Every evening, she prepared dinner for her husband, Mark, and their 2 teenage children, Lily and... Tonight was no different. The table was set with their finest china, the silverware polished to a mirror shine. The aroma of roasted chicken and fresh bread filled the house, blending with the scent of lavender from the candles flickering on the table. It was a picture-perfect setting for a family meal. As she placed the last dish on the table, Sarah called out to her family. "Dinner's ready," she announced, her voice carrying through the house. Mark appeared first, a tall man with graying hair and a kind smile. He wrapped his arms around Sarah and kissed her on the cheek. "Smells delicious, as always," he said warmly. Lily and Ethan soon followed, both in their early teens and wrapped up in their own worlds. Lily, with her headphones perpetually glued to her ears, was glued to her phone, while Ethan, slightly younger, was engrossed in a handheld game console. They all took their places at the table, the usual chatter and clatter of dinner filling the room. But tonight, there was something different in the air. Something subtle, something almost imperceptible, but undeniably a tension that hadn't been present before, a weight that hung over the family like an invisible shroud. As they began to eat, the conversation was light, mostly revolving around the children's day at school and Mark's latest project at work. But beneath the surface, Sarah could feel it, an unease that gnawed at the edges of her consciousness, a sense that something was out of place. It was during the second course that the first sign appeared, a slight flicker in the lights, just a momentary dimming, but enough to catch Sarah's attention. She looked up, her fork halfway to her mouth, but no one else seemed to notice. Mark was talking about a meeting he had the next day, and Lily was too absorbed in her phone to care. The lights returned to normal, and Sarah shook her head, dismissing it as a minor electrical glitch. But the feeling of unease persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute. As the meal progressed, the tension in the air became more palpable. The candles on the table began to sputter, their flames dancing wildly as if caught in an unseen breeze. The temperature in the room dropped, the warmth of the homey kitchen giving way to a chill that crept into their bones. By the time dessert was served, the atmosphere had become almost oppressive. The conversation had dwindled to awkward silences, each family member retreating into their own thoughts. Even the food, which had started off so delicious, now seemed bland and... When the last bite of dessert was finished, Mark leaned back in his chair and let out a satisfied sigh. "That was excellent, honey," he said, but there was a strain in his voice, a tightness that Sarah couldn't ignore. "Thanks," she replied, forcing a smile. "I'll clear the table." But as she stood to gather the plates, something caught her eye. A shadow moving just outside the kitchen window. It was quick, barely more than a flicker, but it sent a jolt of fear through her. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Mark looked up, his brow furrowed. "See what?" "There was someone outside," Sarah said, her eyes fixed on the window. Lily and Ethan glanced up from their distractions, their expressions mirroring their father's confusion. "I didn't see anything," Mark said after a moment, rising from his seat to join her at the window. He peered out into the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the quiet, empty backyard illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights. "You're probably just tired," Mark suggested, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's been a long day." Sarah nodded, but the unease refused to leave her. "Yeah, maybe," she murmured, though she didn't believe it herself. They finished clearing the table in silence, the sense of normalcy slipping further and further away. The shadow outside the window lingered in Sarah's mind, a dark blot on the otherwise perfect evening. And then, as they were about to retire to the living room, the power went out. Chapter 1. The house was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the dying embers of the candles on the dinner table. For a moment, there was silence. Thick, suffocating silence. Then the kids began to... "Mom? Dad?" Ethan's voice was small, fearful. "It's okay, sweetheart," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice calm. "It's just a power outage." Mark was already moving towards the kitchen drawer where they kept the flashlights. "I'll go check the fuse box," he said, his tone steady. But when he opened the drawer, he found empty. The flashlights were gone. That's odd, he muttered. I could have sworn we had flashlights in here. Maybe they're in the garage, Sarah suggested, her voice laced with anxiety. I'll go check. She turned to leave, but Mark stopped her. No, you stay here with the kids. The garage was connected to the house by a narrow hallway, and as Mark made his way through the darkened corridor, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the sound of his footsteps echoing off the walls. When he reached the garage door, he hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The garage was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights outside. Mark fumbled for the light switch, but nothing happened when he flicked it on. Damn it, he cursed under his breath. He moved towards the shelf where they usually kept the flashlights, but his hand brushed against something cold and wet. He jerked back, his heart racing. Slowly, he reached out again, his fingers brushing against the object. It was slimy, almost like blood. Mark yanked his hand back, stumbling away from the shelf. He couldn't see anything in the darkness, but the coppery scent in the air confirmed his worst fears. Something was in the garage with him. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as he backed towards the door, his eyes wide with terror. He had to get back to the house, had to protect his family. But as he reached for the doorknob, a cold hand clamped down on his shoulder. Mark spun around, his scream dying in his throat as he came face to face with a shadowy figure. The figure's face was obscured by darkness, but its eyes, those cold, lifeless eyes, gleamed with a malevolent hunger. Mark, the figure whispered, its voice a rasping hiss. Mark tried to pull away, but the figure's grip was like iron. It pulled him closer, its breath hot and rancid against his skin. Join us. And then everything went black. Chapter 2. The Unseen Terror. Back in the house, Sarah was growing increasingly anxious. Mark had been gone too long. The power outage, the missing flashlights, the shadow outside, everything was adding up to something far more sinister than just a simple blackout. Mom, where's Dad? Lily asked, her voice trembling. She was standing close to Sarah, her usual teenage bravado replaced by genuine fear. He's just getting the flashlights, Sarah replied, though her voice lacked conviction. He'll be back soon. But as the minutes ticked by, Sarah's worry deepened. She couldn't just sit there and wait. Something was wrong. She could feel it. Stay here with your brother, Sarah instructed Lily. I'm going to check on your father. Lily grabbed her mother's arm, her eyes wide with fear. No, Mom, don't go! I have to, Sarah said gently, prying Lily's hand off. I'll be right back, I promise. She made her way to the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. The darkness seemed to press in on her from all sides, and the cold air chilled her to the bone. As she approached the garage door, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. What if something had happened to Mark? What if he was hurt, or worse? The thought sent a jolt of fear through her, but she steeled herself and opened the door. The garage was pitch black, the only sound the faint rustling of something in the far corner. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stepped inside, her hand reaching out blindly in the darkness. Mark, she called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no response. She took another step forward, her foot brushing against something on the floor. She knelt down, her fingers brushing against cold, wet fabric. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized she was touching Mark's shirt, soaked in blood. Mark, she cried out, her voice trembling with fear. She felt around frantically, but there was no sign of him. Just the blood, sticky and cold on her hands. But suddenly the door slammed shut behind her, plunging the garage into total darkness. Sarah whirled around, her back pressed against the wall, her mind racing. She wasn't alone. There was something in the garage with her, something that had taken Mark. She could feel its presence, could hear its ragged breathing, but she couldn't. Who's there? She demanded, her voice shaking. What do you want? A low guttural growl echoed through the garage, sending a wave of terror through her. Sarah pressed herself harder against the wall, her mind screaming at her to run, to get out of there. But her legs wouldn't move. She was paralyzed by fear. The growling grew louder, closer, and Sarah could feel hot breath on her face, smell the stench of decay. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself for the inevitable. And then suddenly, the growling stopped. Sarah opened her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. The garage was silent, the darkness oppressive. She couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything. But she knew that whatever had been in the garage with her was still there, watching her, waiting. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, Sarah slowly inched her way towards the door. Her hand groped for the doorknob, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Just as her fingers closed around the cold metal, she felt a hand clamp down on her wrist, yanking her back into the darkness. She screamed, struggling against the iron grip, but it was no use. The unseen force was too strong, too powerful. "Join us," a voice whispered in her ear, the same voice that had spoken to Mark. "No," Sarah cried, her voice trembling with fear. "Let me go." But the grip tightened, pulling her deeper into the darkness. She could feel herself slipping away, could feel the cold seeping into her bones. The last thing she heard before everything went black was that same chilling whisper. "Join us." The revelation. Lily and Ethan waited in the darkened living room, their fear growing with each passing minute. Their parents had been gone for too long, and the oppressive silence of the house was suffocating. "Where's Mom and Dad?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. "Why aren't they back yet?" "I don't know," Lily replied, her own fear barely contained. "But we need to stay here and wait for them." But even as she said it, Lily knew something was terribly wrong. The power outage, the missing flashlights, the strange behavior of their parents, it all added up to something far more sinister than just a simple blackout. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the house, breaking the silence. Lily and Ethan froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. "Mom? Dad?" Lily called out, her voice shaky. But there was no response, just the steady, deliberate sound of footsteps growing closer. Lily grabbed Ethan's hand, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to hide," she whispered urgently. The two of them scrambled to their feet, their hearts racing as they frantically looked for a place to hide. The footsteps were getting closer, louder, and they could hear the sound of something dragging across the floor. Lily spotted a small closet at the end of the hallway and quickly pulled Ethan inside. They huddled together in the darkness, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The footsteps stopped just outside the closet door. Lily clapped a hand over Ethan's mouth, her own breath caught in her throat as she listened intently. For a moment, there was silence. Thick, suffocating silence. Then, the doorknob slowly got. Lily's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with fear. What was out there? Was it her parents, or something far more sinister? The door creaked open, and a shadowy figure loomed in the doorway. Lily bit her lip to keep from screaming as she pressed herself harder against the back of the closet. The figure stepped into the closet, its presence filling the small space with a cold, suffocating darkness. Lily could feel its eyes on her, could feel its breath on her skin. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying that it would go away, that they would be safe. But then the figure spoke. "Lily, Ethan, come out and play." It was their mother's voice, but it was wrong, twisted, filled with malice. Lily's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding in her chest as she realized the truth. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't their mother. "We have to run," Lily whispered urgently to Ethan. "Now!" Without waiting for a response, Lily pushed past the figure and bolted out of the closet, dragging Ethan behind her. They sprinted down the hallway, their hearts pounding in their chests as they made for the front door. But the figure was right behind them, its footsteps echoing through the house as it pursued them. Lily could feel its cold breath on her neck, could hear its low, guttural growl as it closed in on them. They reached the front door, but it was locked. No matter how hard they pulled, it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through Lily as she fumbled with the lock, her hands trembling. "Hurry, Lily," Ethan cried, his voice filled with fear. "I'm trying," Lily gasped, her heart racing. But the lock wouldn't turn. It was as if something was holding it in place. The figure was almost upon them, its presence looming over them like a dark cloud. Lily could feel the cold seeping into her bones, could feel the darkness closing in. And then, just as the figure reached out to grab them, the front door burst open, flooding the hallway with blinding light. Lily and Ethan stumbled outside, the sudden brightness disorienting them. They turned to look back, but the figure was gone, vanished into the darkness of the house. They stood there for a moment, panting and trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But as the adrenaline began to wear off, a new fear took hold of them. Their parents were still inside. Chapter 4. The Final Stand. Lily and Ethan knew they couldn't just leave their parents behind, no matter how terrified they were. Summoning every ounce of courage they had left, they turned back towards the house. But as they approached the front door, they noticed something strange. The house was no longer dark. The lights were on, the warmth of the homey interior spilling out onto the porch. It was as if nothing had happened. Lily exchanged a worried glance with Ethan, but they both knew what they had to do. They stepped cautiously back into the house, their senses on high alert. The living room was empty, the remnants of their dinner still on the table. The air was warm again, the oppressive cold and darkness gone. For a moment, they dared to hope that it had all been a bad dream. But as they moved deeper into the house, they found their parents standing in the kitchen, their backs to them. Relief flooded through Lily, and she ran towards them. "Mom, Dad, you're okay." But as she reached out to touch them, they both turned around slowly, and the relief turned to horror. Their parents' faces were blank, their eyes lifeless, their skin pale and cold. They moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, as if being controlled by some unseen force. "Join us," they whispered in unison, their voices hollow and distorted. Lily stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't her parents. It couldn't be. But before she could react, they lunged at her, their cold hands reaching out to drag her into the darkness. "Run, Ethan," Lily screamed, shoving her brother towards the door. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his eyes wide with fear, but then he bolted towards the door, leaving Lily to fend off the twisted versions of their parents. But as he reached the threshold, he froze. Standing in the doorway was another figure, a man, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his face obscured by shadows. He looked at Ethan with a twisted smile, his voice low and menacing. "Join us. Seed." Ethan backed away, his heart pounding in his chest as he realized he was trapped. The figure in the doorway blocked his only escape route, and his parents were closing in on him from behind. Lily was still struggling with the twisted versions of their parents, but she managed to grab a nearby chair and swing it at them. The chair shattered against their bodies, but it didn't seem to faze them. They kept coming, their cold hands reaching out to drag her into the darkness. Desperate, Lily grabbed a nearby knife and slashed at them. The blade sliced through the air, but instead of cutting them, it passed right through them as if they were made of smoke. Panic surged through her as she realized the futility of her actions. These weren't her parents. They were something else, something far more sinister. But she couldn't give up. She had to protect Ethan, had to get them out of there. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, she charged at the twisted figures, slashing wildly with the knife. But it was no use. The figures were too strong, too relentless. They grabbed her, their cold hands clamping down on her wrists, and dragged her towards the dark. "Join us," they whispered, their voices filling her mind. Lily struggled, but she could feel her strength slipping away, could feel the darkness closing in around her. She could hear Ethan's panicked cries, but they were getting fainter, more distant. And then, just as she was about to be consumed by the darkness, a blinding light filled the room. The twisted figures recoiled, their grip loosening as they shrank away from the light. Lily fell to the floor, gasping for breath, her mind reeling from the experience. When she looked up, she saw that the figure in the doorway was gone, replaced by a woman bathed in light. The woman's face was kind, her eyes filled with compassion. "You must leave this place," the woman said, her voice soft but firm. "It is not safe." Lily nodded weakly, her mind still struggling to process everything that had happened. She stumbled to her feet and grabbed Ethan's hand, pulling him towards the door. As they stepped outside, the light from the woman grew brighter and brighter until it was blinding. Lily shielded her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest as she felt a strange sensation, a feeling of being lifted, of being pulled away from the darkness. When the light finally faded, Lily and Ethan found themselves standing in the middle of the street, the house behind them silent and dark. The oppressive cold and darkness were gone, replaced by the warm glow of the streetlights. They looked at each other, their minds still reeling from the experience, but they both knew one thing for sure. They could never go back to that house. As they walked away, hand in hand, they could still hear the faint whispers of the twisted figures echoing in their minds. "Join us." A haunting memory. Lily and Ethan never spoke of that night again. They moved in with their aunt, far away from Maple Street, and tried to rebuild their lives. But the memory of that night, of the twisted figures in the cold darkness, never left them. Sometimes, late at night, Lily would wake up in a cold sweat, the whispers echoing in her mind. She would look over at Ethan, still sleeping peacefully, and remind herself that they were safe now. But deep down, she knew that the darkness would always be with them, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike again. And as she lay there in the dark, she could still hear the faint whisper of the twisted figures echoing in her mind. Join us